There's a sentence almost every empath eventually says to herself, usually late at night, usually after years of trying every version of love she knows how to give. If I had just loved him enough, differently enough, patiently enough, this would have worked. This sentence carries an assumption worth examining directly today because it's kept people trapped in exhausting cycles of self-blame far longer than the actual truth ever should have allowed. Your love was never enough. And today, we're going to trace exactly why that's true, not because you failed to love adequately, but because enough love was never actually the variable that determined whether the relationship could succeed in the first place. Let's start with something crucial to understand about what love is actually capable of accomplishing and what it structurally cannot, regardless of how genuine, how patient, or how sustained it happens to be. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the structural nature of narcissistic psychology. Genuine remorse requires holding two contradictory self-perceptions simultaneously, being fundamentally decent while acknowledging having caused harm, a capacity his psychological architecture cannot sustain without triggering defensive collapse. This structural limitation exists independent of how much love arrives from outside. Love, however profound, cannot rebuild an internal architecture that requires years of dedicated professional work, genuine willingness to tolerate exactly the discomfort his defenses were built to avoid, and sustained effort that has almost nothing to do with any single relationship, however devoted. This is the first, most fundamental reason your love was never enough. You were trying to solve a structural problem using an emotional solution, and structural problems don't respond to emotional solutions, regardless of their intensity or their genuineness. Remember what we discussed extensively about why narcissists cannot feel remorse, not won't, but cannot, in the same way someone without functioning legs cannot simply try harder to walk. Love doesn't build the missing architecture. It can't, because love was never designed to serve that function in the first place. Here's the second reason worth understanding, one connecting to something we traced in our conversation about why narcissists need attention more than love. Remember the crucial distinction we established. Attention functions as urgent psychological necessity, the literal material his fragmented sense of self depends on for coherence. Love, in its genuine, mature form, requires sustained attunement to another person's internal experience, independent of what that attunement produces in return. These represent fundamentally different psychological transactions, which means your love, however profound, was never actually the currency his psychology was seeking in the first place. You were offering something valuable, but you were offering the wrong currency entirely, one his particular psychological economy simply couldn't process or exchange for what you were hoping to receive back. This explains something that likely confused you for years throughout the relationship, the sense that no matter how much love you offered, it never seemed to accumulate into anything, never seemed to build toward the security or reciprocity you kept expecting eventually to develop. It never accumulated because it was never actually being received as love at all. It was being received, processed, and consumed as attention, momentarily satisfying, immediately requiring replenishment, incapable of building into anything lasting precisely because attention, unlike love, doesn't accumulate. It simply gets consumed and requires more. Here's the third reason, connecting to something we discussed extensively about why deep suffering transforms an empath. Remember the concept of load-bearing wisdom, the capacity to hold complexity that requires exactly the kind of psychological sophistication most people never develop without significant hardship. Your love, offered before you'd developed this wisdom, likely lacked something crucial. Discernment about when love should be withheld rather than extended, when patience actually enables harm rather than fostering growth. This isn't a failure of your capacity to love. It's simply evidence that love without discernment, however genuine, cannot accomplish what love paired with discernment eventually can. Together, These three reasons, the structural nature of what he actually needed to change, the fundamental mismatch between love and attention as psychological currencies, and the absence of discernment that early undeveloped love typically lacks. Begin explaining why your love, regardless of its genuine depth and sincerity, was never actually capable of producing the transformation you kept hoping it eventually would. Understanding that your love was never the missing ingredient leads to an uncomfortable question. If love wasn't the answer, why did it feel as though giving more of it almost worked? Why were there moments when he seemed softer, more affectionate, even briefly appreciative? Those moments weren't imaginary, they were real. The mistake was assuming they represented lasting transformation rather than temporary emotional states. Human beings naturally interpret consistency from isolated moments of hope. When someone who has been emotionally distant suddenly becomes warm, our minds don't simply enjoy the warmth, we begin building a future around it. We assume we've finally discovered the right approach. In reality, those moments often reflected changing circumstances rather than changing character. This distinction matters because many empaths unknowingly measure progress by intensity instead of stability. A passionate apology feels significant. An emotional promise sounds convincing. A weekend filled with affection appears to erase months of disappointment. But genuine change isn't measured by emotional intensity. It's measured by behavioral consistency over long periods of time, especially when no immediate reward exists for behaving differently. That's why sustainable psychological growth rarely announces itself through dramatic moments. It reveals itself through ordinary ones, through the difficult conversation where someone chooses accountability instead of defensiveness, through repeated respect for boundaries that once felt threatening, through the willingness to tolerate discomfort without immediately searching for someone else to blame. Those are structural changes because they reflect a different way of relating to reality, not simply a different emotional mood. There's another misunderstanding that keeps many compassionate people trapped. We often assume that if someone cannot receive healthy love, the answer must be to love them even more carefully. We become more patient, more understanding, more forgiving. We explain ourselves with greater kindness. We lower our expectations, believing that reducing pressure will somehow create emotional safety for the other person. Unfortunately, psychology doesn't usually work that way. When healthy boundaries disappear, unhealthy dynamics don't automatically heal. They often become stronger. Every accommodation quietly teaches the relationship what it can continue expecting. Every boundary you abandon becomes part of the relationship's new normal. Every sacrifice made without mutual responsibility slowly changes the emotional balance between two people. This is why many empaths eventually discover something deeply painful. They weren't strengthening the relationship by carrying more of its emotional weight. They were unintentionally making it possible for the imbalance to continue. Love can support growth. Love cannot replace responsibility. Those two ideas sound similar, but they lead to completely different outcomes. Think about any meaningful area of life. A supportive teacher cannot learn on behalf of a student. A caring coach cannot become physically stronger for the athlete. A devoted therapist cannot perform another person's emotional work. Encouragement creates opportunity, but participation remains personal. Relationships operate under exactly the same principle. One of the greatest acts of self-compassion is recognizing the difference between helping someone and attempting to become responsible for who they eventually become. That responsibility was never yours. Another important shift begins when you stop asking whether you loved enough and start asking a different question altogether. Was love the only thing keeping the relationship alive? Many people are surprised by the answer. Sometimes the relationship survived not because both people were building it together, but because one person refused to let it collapse. One partner consistently initiated difficult conversations, one apologized first, One repaired conflict, one carried hope through periods when hope no longer had much evidence supporting it. When only one person repeatedly performs the emotional labor necessary to keep a relationship functioning, the relationship may continue existing, but it isn't becoming healthier. It's becoming dependent on imbalance. That's an incredibly important distinction. Because once the empath finally becomes emotionally exhausted, the relationship often appears to fall apart suddenly. In reality, it had been weakening for years. The exhaustion simply revealed what had already been true. This is also why so many survivors experience guilt after leaving. They mistake ending the cycle for causing the collapse. But ending an unhealthy pattern isn't the same as creating it. Sometimes walking away doesn't destroy the relationship. It reveals that the relationship could not survive without one person continuously sacrificing themselves. That realization is painful, but it's also deeply liberating because once you understand that truth, you stop measuring your worth by an outcome that was never entirely within your control. And that's where the most important shift begins, not in how much love you're capable of giving, but in finally understanding where healthy love must also include yourself. Because without that final piece, even the deepest love eventually becomes another way of abandoning the person who needed your compassion the most, you. And perhaps that's the hardest lesson of all. For a long time, you believed the greatest expression of love was endurance. You believed that staying, forgiving, understanding, and trying one more time proved the depth of your commitment. The more difficult the relationship became, the more determined you felt to love through it. Somewhere along the way, perseverance became your definition of devotion. But healthy love was never meant to be measured by how much pain you can survive. It was meant to be measured by how much mutual growth it creates. That's an entirely different standard. When two emotionally healthy people love each other, both lives gradually become larger. There is more trust, not less. More emotional safety, not more confusion. More freedom to be authentic, not more fear of saying the wrong thing. Healthy love expands both people simultaneously because neither person has to disappear for the relationship to continue. That is why one of the clearest signs that something is fundamentally wrong isn't constant conflict, it's gradual self-abandonment. You stop expressing your opinions because it's easier than arguing. You stop asking for reassurance because you're afraid of being called needy. You stop celebrating your achievements because they somehow become competitions instead of shared victories. Little by little, your world becomes smaller. Not because you wanted less from life, because preserving the relationship quietly became more important than preserving yourself. No amount of love can compensate for that imbalance. Another truth becomes clear once enough time has passed. You weren't asking for perfection. You were asking for reciprocity. You wanted your feelings to matter as much as theirs. You wanted accountability after hurtful behavior. You wanted consistency instead of unpredictability. You wanted a relationship where both people accepted responsibility for protecting the connection. Those expectations weren't unrealistic. They were healthy. Many survivors spend years convincing themselves they expected too much. In reality, they often expected the minimum conditions necessary for emotional security. That's an important difference. Because when someone repeatedly tells you that your needs are excessive, you eventually stop questioning the relationship and start questioning yourself. The real healing begins when that direction changes. Instead of asking, "Why wasn't I enough?" you begin asking, "Why did I spend so long believing I had to earn what should have been freely given?" Love was never supposed to feel like a permanent audition. It was never meant to require constant proof of your worth. It was never designed to leave you wondering whether one more sacrifice would finally make you deserving of kindness. Healthy love doesn't constantly test your value. It recognizes it. One of the greatest misconceptions about healing is that it happens the day you leave. For most people, healing begins much later. It begins the first time you trust your own perception again, the first time you say no without apologizing, the first time you realize someone else's disappointment doesn't automatically make you a bad person. Those moments seem ordinary, yet they're rebuilding something much deeper than confidence. They're rebuilding self-trust. And without self-trust, even healthy love becomes difficult to recognize. Because when you've spent years doubting your own instincts, kindness can feel unfamiliar, while inconsistency feels normal. Part of recovery is allowing your nervous system to learn a new definition of safety, one where peace doesn't feel boring, one where respect doesn't feel suspicious, one where stability isn't mistaken for a lack of passion. That process takes time, but it changes everything. Eventually, something remarkable happens. You stop wishing the past had been different, not because it no longer hurts, but because you finally understand that the outcome was never determined by the amount of love you carried. It was determined by whether two people were equally willing to build something healthy together. And that was never a responsibility you could fulfill alone. If there's one truth worth carrying forward, let it be this. Your love wasn't too small. Your patience wasn't too short. Your compassion wasn't too weak. You simply tried to solve a problem that love, by itself, was never designed to solve. Real change requires willingness. It requires accountability. It requires the courage to confront uncomfortable truths about oneself. No one, not a partner, not a family member, not even the deepest love in the world can make that choice for another human being. But you can make one choice for yourself. You can stop measuring your value by someone else's capacity to receive what you offered. You can stop carrying responsibility that never belonged to you, and you can begin giving yourself the same patience, kindness, and understanding that you spent so many years trying to give someone else. Because the question was never whether your love was enough. The real question was whether the relationship had the psychological foundation necessary to receive that love in the first place. Once you understand the difference, the years of self-blame begin to lose their grip, and in their place comes something far more valuable than the relationship you were trying to save: clarity. Because clarity doesn't erase the past, but it does prevent you from repeating it. And sometimes that is the most powerful form of healing a person can ever experience. For a long time, your attention may have been focused on one outcome: making the relationship work. Every decision was filtered through that single objective. You learned to choose your words carefully. You anticipated difficult conversations before they happened. You became highly skilled at reading emotional shifts, trying to prevent conflict before it even began. Without realizing it, your entire emotional world slowly reorganized itself around keeping another person emotionally stable. The problem is that this way of living gradually disconnects you from yourself. You become so practiced at noticing another person's needs that your own needs become difficult to recognize. When someone asks what you want, you hesitate. When someone asks how you feel, you instinctively think about how everyone else feels first. That isn't because you've become weak. It's because your emotional energy has been directed outward for so long that looking inward feels unfamiliar. One of the most profound parts of healing is learning that your own emotional life deserves the same attention you once gave everyone else's. That sounds simple. In reality, it can feel deeply uncomfortable. The first time you choose your own peace instead of another unnecessary argument, guilt may appear. The first time you decline a conversation that you know will only leave you exhausted, guilt may appear again. The first time you refuse to explain a healthy boundary over and over simply to make someone else comfortable, you may wonder whether you've become selfish. But selfishness and self-respect are not the same thing. Selfishness ignores the needs of others. Self-respect refuses to ignore your own. Those two ideas are separated by an enormous psychological difference. Many empaths confuse the two because they spent years receiving the message that prioritizing themselves was somehow unkind. Yet healthy relationships don't require one person to disappear so another can feel secure. They allow both people to exist fully. with needs, opinions, boundaries, and imperfections that deserve equal respect. Another shift happens when you stop looking at the relationship through isolated memories and begin looking at it through recurring patterns. Individual memories can be incredibly persuasive. You remember the holiday where everything felt perfect, the conversation where they seemed genuinely vulnerable, the unexpected act of kindness that gave you hope all over again. Those memories are real, but they are only part of the story. Patterns tell a different story. Patterns ask different questions. How were disagreements usually resolved? Who carried the responsibility for repairing conflict? Who consistently adjusted themselves to preserve the relationship? Who apologized more often? Who felt responsible for the emotional climate between the two of you? When you answer those questions honestly, the relationship often becomes much clearer than it appeared while you were living inside it. That's why psychologists often encourage people to examine patterns rather than isolated events. Patterns reveal the structure, moments reveal exceptions, and when the exceptions become more memorable than the everyday reality, hope can quietly replace objectivity. There's another lesson that many people don't fully appreciate until much later. Healing is not the absence of grief. You may still miss the person. You may still miss the future you imagined together. You may even miss parts of the relationship that were genuinely beautiful. None of those feelings mean leaving was the wrong decision. Human beings are capable of grieving something that was unhealthy while also recognizing it could not continue. Those two realities can exist at the same time. You can miss someone and still know they were not good for your emotional well-being. You can appreciate the happy memories while refusing to ignore the painful ones. You can wish them peace without inviting them back into your life. That emotional complexity isn't weakness, it's maturity. As time passes, something else begins changing. The questions themselves become different. Early in healing, people often ask, "Why did this happen to me?" Later they ask, "What can I learn from this experience?" Eventually they ask something even more powerful. "How can I build relationships that reflect the person I'm becoming today?" That final question points toward the future, instead of keeping your attention permanently fixed on the past. And that's where growth truly begins. You become less interested in finding someone who simply needs your love. You become more interested in finding someone who knows how to return it. You stop confusing emotional intensity with emotional intimacy. You begin recognizing that consistency, honesty, accountability, and mutual respect may not feel as dramatic as emotional highs and lows, but they create something far more valuable. They create peace. And peace is often underestimated until you've lived without it for a long time. Perhaps the greatest gift this experience can eventually give you is not greater suspicion. It's greater discernment. Discernment allows you to remain compassionate without becoming naive.